We are here today to talk about a whole bunch of stuff that's happened, well, really across the last 2 weeks, particularly the job retention scheme, the extension of furlough and how to access that and what it means, and then also the business grants, and particularly the discretionary area of the grants, and also how you will be given those grants in various countries. So most of the meeting will be for everybody on this one, but some bits, I'm afraid, will be specific to either England, Scotland, or Northern Ireland. But thanks for joining in. I can see the 51 of you are already watching. Again, you can please drop comments or questions into the chat windows when they come up for us. Do say good afternoon. Always like to see who's there. Hello, everybody. So for today's meeting, I am joined by King of the Hands nerds, and well, actually that's Clara Cullen, but Deputy King of the Hands nerd, Mr. Chris Sherrington. Hello, Chris.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Hello, Mark.
Right. So, without too much ado, I'll do a quick overview, and you pick me up on anything I get wrong. So, the government, first of all, announced the job support scheme. So that was announced 7 days ago, which resulted in you and me staying up till some obscene hour of the morning, taking it all apart to understand it. And then 18 hours later, they cancelled that and announced they were extending the job retention scheme, which everybody calls furlough. And that was announced on Saturday. Details were then released on Tuesday, I think.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and then on Thursday, Rishi Sunak has now announced that that is being extended at this level, as I understand it, all the way through until March 31st. Correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And so basically what that means immediately is that the job support scheme, the earliest date that that will apply, having done all that work to understand it, the earliest date that could apply would be 1st of April, but in all likelihood that project is abandoned altogether, correct?
Yeah, it's been suggested that might be abandoned altogether, but we'll see what happens when it comes to April time as to whether or not they reinstate it. Okay,
and I think that raises quite a crucial point, actually, which is that the job support scheme did contain within it two versions, closed and open. Yeah. And the closed one was where you were at a tier level where your venue would literally not be allowed to open. But at lower levels, tier 2 or tier 1, you could actually apply for job support scheme because your business was restricted. That's a fair reading of it?
Yeah, the open one allowed you to kind of have staff being paid and then getting topped up by the government, and they changed that from the original. In any case, originally it was a scheme that nobody thought anyone was going to use because the employer had to top up a third and the government would top up a third, but actually that then got changed to 5% and 61.67. It became a better scheme then, but still not great.
Okay, so then when they reintroduced the job retention scheme, it appears that this time around they ported over that concept. That in fact there are, well, I mean, you probably want to get straight into like presenting on it, but yeah. So people can see the line of travel here. It appears to me that there are now a closed and open version of the job retention scheme. Is that right?
I mean, there always was in some ways, in as much as people could bring back staff and employ them and they would just receive less. They could take people off furlough, and they've continued on with that nature of it. So people can take people, if they've got people coming back to work, they can still give them reduced hours and then it will get topped up for the hours that they're not working. So in some ways it was very similar to that. But yeah, the job retention scheme is basically exactly the same as how we were in August of this year, as to the level that's being done. It's going up to 80%, and it is available. And the only contributions that employers will have to pay are national insurance contributions and pension contributions if they make pension contributions.
Okay, and then Russell Lockamore has immediately raised the thing. Nick Stewart did some amazing spreadsheet calculations of the impact of the job support scheme, and those were specifically highlighting the opportunity that if you use the employer contribution scheme, where you would receive, obviously he's saying the employer contribution level for furlough scheme, but there was a scheme where you would be paid, I forget how much it was, £1,000 for retaining somebody.
Yeah, so there was, as well as the job retention scheme, which is the furlough scheme, there was then a job retention bonus scheme, which was announced, which would have come into effect in January, February of this year. And it was based on how much employees got paid for the 3 months up to that period. And it was going to be £1,000 if the employee received 1,560 over that. Now, that there have been conversations that is probably going to also come back in again at the end of whenever furlough kicks off. So we can expect to see that probably around July next year, probably around August that time. But what, I say the Russell was saying is that this scheme is going to continue. The job retention scheme is going to continue as it is all the way through till March, but it was going to get reviewed in January to see as to whether or not there need to be changes made to it, which again might involve the employer contribution reducing down as it did at the end of this scheme, because it went from 80 to 70 to 60. That may well happen again, but at the moment,
everybody, look at that, just popped in with my tea.
At the moment, they're saying that the scheme will stay the same, but they're going to review it in January.
Okay, I think the inference of Thursday's, to deal with Russell's question specifically, the inference of Thursday's announcement was you can now rely upon the job retention scheme until at least the 31st of March if you are closed or your business is restricted. Yeah. So a lot of people are asking about the conflict between the Cultural Recovery Fund and the furlough scheme, but let's come back to that. So, Chris, tell us all about the exciting, I shall grip the sides of my chair. Do you want to tell us all about the exciting job retention scheme?
Yeah. So the job retention scheme, as I mentioned, is exactly the same as the furlough scheme we've had for the last few months. It is based at the level that we had back in August, which was that employees will receive 80% of their usual salary for any hours not worked, up to the maximum of 2,500, which is the same cap. And the only thing that the employers will be asked to contribute is any national insurance contributions and any pension contributions. And they can also still top up if they want to as well for individual employees. Pretty much it's exactly the same scheme. The only differences that we've seen is that new staff and staff who were not eligible because they may have not been on payroll at a certain point back in April are now eligible for it. And so staff can, new staff that you may have taken on if you reopen, for example, can be put onto it as long as they've been on the payroll by a certain date, which I would go through in a second. And it is, as Mark says, will be carrying on for the next few months. And it will be pretty much the same as it was before with regards to payments and claim periods as well. Claim periods which are usually running from the first of the month to the end of the month. But yeah, it is pretty much exactly the same scheme. People still may need to they need to make sure there are agreements in place with their staff agreeing that that they're being put on furlough. The minimum claim period is 7 consecutive days, and if people do reopen or are using staff for other things such as for streaming or for things, then they can take them off furlough for that period of time and then put them back on. But the minimum claim period must be 7 consecutive calendar days, which is exactly the same as it was before. The good thing about this scheme is, again, that by now most people's accountants and payroll clerks have kind of gotten used to it. And it's just a continuation on that scheme. As I say, the main differences are for any new employees, and it talks about reference hours there. And with regards to that, for any new employees, if an employee was not previously eligible for the scheme, then 80% of the wages is now calculated from either their fixed salary. So if you started them off on a salary basis, then it's 80% of the wages payable in the last pay period, ending on or before the 30th of October. And if their pay varies, then it's 80% of the average pay payable between their start date of their employment, or the 6th of April, whichever is later, and the day that their new furlough period starts.
So let's just pick up on that point, because there's a couple of questions coming on that. So it's basically what you were paying them up until the 30th of October, either because they're paid the same amount every month, or because you average it across the months that you were paying it for. Correct?
New staff, yes. For old staff, for staff that were previously on furlough, then it's exactly the same calculations as they were on before. It's either the higher of their average pay, or it is the what they got paid for the same pay period last year.
Okay, and so the straight question there in the sidebar is: we have staff that have had hours added to their contracts as of 1st of November, as we were expected to be open. Can they be furloughed on their new hours, or do they have to be furloughed on their old hours?
My understanding of that is that they will still be, if they were furloughed before, it would be on their old hours. The only change to that is if they've done more hours, which in the period between March and October of this year, but there are very few people that will be doing more work.
Yeah, that question was specifically if they were planning to increase their hours from 1st of November. That won't qualify, will it? They will have to be furloughed on the old hours.
Yeah, it will still continue to be based on the old hours they were working, and the averages. As to the other thing with that is that, of course, if staff were working, they would have probably, and if we're on minimum wage, and of course national minimum wage has gone up, but there still hasn't been any changes to that. It's still being based on the hours and the average pay up until last year's tax year.
Okay.
What I'll do as well is I'll put a link in the chat window which shows the details about the job retention scheme.
Okay.
You can see that.
This seems, I think one of the things that I've had questions emailed to me and messages on Facebook and everything about was that people feel that this is slightly too good to be true. Is that because it is slightly too good to be true, or what is it?
I think it is the fact that I think everyone's kind of accepted, and there's been a lot of pressure from not just this, because this scheme, the other important thing is this scheme is for the entire UK, is that there has been a lot of pressure from national governments who have had different lockdown periods, that they needed something. The job support scheme was not really good enough to cover closed things across a variety of national governments, and also that people are kind of used to this scheme, and I think they're also concerned that without going too much about lockdown periods, that it's good to have a steady scheme, not have to keep changing things for the upcoming months when there may be further national lockdowns, of course, or regional lockdowns. And also, I'll be perfectly honest, the calculations for the job support scheme were really, really tedious.
They were nightmarish. I mean, we ended up with a spreadsheet that would calculate them on all kinds of different bases of hours that Nick Stewart very kindly created for us. But even with that, it was a nightmarish calculation. This does seem much more clear-cut and much easier to understand, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe because we're just all used to it now. I don't know.
Yeah, there is that. And answering Nico's question as well is that there are a third set of criteria. The link's on the screen there. You can see I can't actually post it into the chat on the side, actually, Mark. But if you go to these details, will be available, and we'll put them in the comments afterwards as well. It does also have a calculation for staff that have increased hours and were working, but it is still based on the higher of three things there, which is what the job support scheme were going to do. But the details are calculated. The other thing I would say is that at the moment, the full details of the calculations aren't being released until the 10th of November.
Yeah.
So we are doing the second webinar next week.
We're doing a second webinar next week to pick up anything we missed this week. Chris, if you want to drop me a link to this document in the private chat window, then I'll go and pick them up, and I can pick these up and put them in the groups. Okay. I know everybody wants to talk about Cultural Recovery Fund and how that impacts with this, but I'm going to come back to that because this affects everybody, and let's stick with the stuff that affects everybody. So, what are you doing there?
I'll get that link for you.
Yeah. Right. So, Chris, tell us about grants.
Yes. So, as well as the job retention scheme, which is affecting staff, there are also a variety of grants which have been put in place. Now, these are, we'll talk about all of the nations, but there were originally grants announced because, of course, there were areas in Tier 2 and Tier 3 and also in other countries that had closed down where there were local restrictions grants that were being put in place. These are called local restriction support grants, and they were due to be announced and put in place by local councils, and actually some local councils have still got that information about Tier 2 and Tier 3 closures. Then when national lockdown was announced, all of those kind of grants were delayed slightly, and as a result, their local councils have now only just been given guidance about how these grants will be administered. The grants fall into two categories, one for the national lockdowns and one for any local restrictions that were before that. And so there's this period now where we've got people who have been, some people in various areas have been shut down since August the 5th. And there will be backdated grants for those periods, for Tier 2, Tier 3, and also for the other nations as well. And then, but going forward, there is a grant which is mainly put in place for businesses that are shut as a result of the national lockdown that is going on up until December the 2nd, and which may, of course, then get extended. As I mentioned, there are different grants for each country. So if it's okay, we'll start off with England and then kind of go from there, if that makes sense. And again, on this document, which Mark will be sharing, there are links to each of these ones on there. As I say, they're called the Local Restriction Support Grants. And in England, there are actually 4 grants. The first of these that I'll quickly mention, and it is completely pointless, is one called the Local Restriction Grants Support Sector. This is for nightclubs and hostess bars only. It is basically for places that were shut under the national restrictions. The grant got put in place on November the 1st and will shut on November the 4th. It's a 4-day grant, so we won't worry too much about this, but it is mainly for places that were shutting down, nightclubs and hostess clubs. So that. The next one is the Local Restrictions Grant Closed. This was originally announced in England for places in Tier 3 that were being forced to close, and it has since then been changed to be the applicable grant for all the national lockdown. So people who are in areas where they had been asked to shut beforehand may receive backdated amounts of this for the closed grant. And then there is one grant that's being put in place for a 28-day period for November. And that's there is then, as that's the addendum, which we'll go into a bit, which will go through the details. There is then the open grant, which is a grant basically for England, for English businesses that were under Tier 2 and Tier 3 that had restricted business. And again, that's backdated to whenever the businesses were asked to be restricted. Again, all these grants finish on November the 5th, and then called ARG, which is a
I'm going to interrupt because Chris, you're cracking up. Do you want to try? Yeah. I'm going to tell Chris to log out and log back in again. Let me just let me tell him. I'm just going to send him a comment to log in and log back. Log out and log back in again. Terrible signal. Yeah, so as you've seen, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on with the documents there. I can do the share screen from here as well, so I'll do that. Application window, we want the Chrome tab, and we want the Furloughs and Grants document. Oh, that looks like he might have come back. Okay, I'm just going to zoom into this document so you can see it again. How to do that? That's a good question. View. So where did we get to? We got to the LSRG open doc. Oh, I think Chris might be back. Are you back?
I hope so. Sorry about that.
That's all right. The signal cracked up a little bit. I've popped my version of this document in there, so if you want to work off mine, it might use slightly less bandwidth.
Okay, that's fine, yeah. Yes, sorry, where have we got to? So
LSRG open.
Yeah. The open grant, as I say, is for the businesses that were in Tier 2 and Tier 3 previously, and again finished on November the 5th when everyone goes into the closed grants. Just to be clear with all of these as well, sorry, there's also the additional recovery grant, which is a discretionary grant, people that have been granted to councils, people that they can give out as they wish. The thing about these grants is that previously they were going to be given out based on who councils thought would be eligible. The councils would then contact national government, tell them how many people they thought were eligible, claim the money, and then give out the money. That has now changed, so that similar to when we had the retail, hospitality and leisure grants, national government has worked out from valuations office information as to how many people should be eligible, how much money there should be for them, and that money will be given to local councils to then distribute. So it's actually a bit more positive because the councils are going to be getting the money whether or not they claim for it or not, or whether or not they think that businesses will be eligible. So it's much more likely that businesses will be able to claim for this. The amount for each of these grants, for the ongoing grant, which is for most of the ones that are closed at the moment under the national lockdown, they will be paid per 28 days of closure. Split into 3 tiers for England, up to 15,000, where they'll get £1,334 per 28 days. For 15k to 51k, this is rate of value, they'll get 2,000, and for over 51k, they'll get 3,000. Again, that's a really big positive because when we had the retail, hospitality and leisure grant, businesses over 51k's were being left out. And so now they will get that money. We're still trying to sort out what the eligibility and criteria will be for some of the businesses, but it is mainly seen as being the hospitality leisure businesses that have been told to close at this point in time. As I mentioned, there are the backdated ones as well for those businesses who are in Tier 2 and Tier 3 areas. Again, the eligibility for this is all on the website, and the amounts of money there are actually per 14 days, and they are 667 for closed businesses, 1,000 for those between 15k and 51, and over 51k they'll get 1,500, and that's on a per 14 days basis because the closures are a bit tighter. And then there is also the open scheme where businesses who were restricted. Yeah.
Chris, I'm just going to drop in and say these are all grants that kind of effectively be distributed by your local authority. There isn't really an application process, is there? It's fairly automatic.
Yeah, so similarly to when we had the retail, hospitality and leisure grants, there will be some variation, but for most of them, they're all going to be done by the local authorities, and people just need to contact their local authority and check on their local authority websites as to how they can apply for them. If they don't think they're eligible, they can also look at the discretionary grants as well.
Yeah, I think that was the point I really wanted to jump in on, which is just to say that in the past, all of these retail, hospitality and leisure grants have been based on solely on your business rates and your rateable value. However, in the ARG, it does appear that the intention is that even if you do not have a rateable value, you can apply to your local authority for a grant. And specifically, it says that discretionary grants should be considered for people working in the events sector.
Yeah, so people who may not necessarily class as a bar or a pub or any of that can still apply for discretionary grants. And if they feel as though they might be out of this, there is that discretionary grant availability as well. And as you say, the specific wording does talk about people in the supply chain. So, people who work as recording studios or rehearsal spaces can also apply for this.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, I have to say the music industry got terribly excited when it read that, because I don't think they'd really registered how much money there was. It was suggested to me that this might save festivals, and I said, well, what, 2,500 or £2,000 a month or whatever it is? I don't think so, but it certainly is worth any members that have previously not been able to access these grants, because they were all based on whether you basically had a rateable value for your premises or not. This is the point to have a discussion with your local authority about making sure they do include your discretionary grant in this period, isn't it?
Yes, and also to discuss with them about backdating for any businesses that have been affected in tier 2 or tier 3 as well, and make sure they're eligible for it. The other thing at the moment is, as I say, the local authorities only really got this data about 3 days ago, and many of them, although they'd started putting plans together for the tier 3 closure grants, have had to completely change that. So it is really worth having those conversations with people, particularly local councillors in the either regeneration or culture councillors, if you can get details of them, because the actual department that will be looking after the grants might vary from council to council. It's usually business rates and revenue, but they have seen that it's been done by other people in other areas. So talking to local councillors is really important for people to start making those contacts now.
I'm going to pick up a few of these questions. Brian Barnes says we could not adhere to RA for tier 3. So are we claiming from that point of that closure, or 2 claims? I think it's 2 claims, isn't it?
It will depend on each council as to how they do it. But because the grants are split off into 2 grants, there's the one for the national closures now and for the ones before. They may well administer it as 2 separate claims.
Somebody says most authorities I've spoken to, we do an application process, as LAs won't know if a business is open or not. In the case of the national funds, we think it's a mixed answer on that, which is where it is plainly that you are closed, we expect the retail, hospitality and leisure grants process, where you are automatically credited as a rate holder, to apply. There aren't that many exceptions within our membership of what we would consider to be closed. And later on, somebody asked about, can a closed public venue temporarily used for rehearsals, recordings, are we allowed to apply for the LRSG closed grant? I've asked that question directly to DCMS and pointed out that people doing streaming or allowing recording or rehearsals are not actually open, and therefore they should be considered closed. And if they decide they're not, then it may work out economically more viable for them not to allow the streaming and the rehearsal and the recording. DCMS have gone and taken that to Treasury, and we should have an answer on that fairly soon. But I think at the moment you can assume that government wants to allow streaming and recording and rehearsals to go ahead, and that brought forward the concept that that may not happen if you don't get the closed grant. I would expect the answer to be you are closed for business and are able to get the closed thing. You are making your facility available for rehearsals and recording and streaming. But I need confirmation on that. Discretionary fund is £1.1 billion across the UK, but is expected to last 18 months. At the moment, I would say an answer to that one. Does this mean the promoters could apply to this discretionary grant as we would have no rateable value? Yes, it does. You need to contact your local authority if you do not have rateable value. Did I miss how much the discretionary rate could be? No, you didn't, because it is entirely discretionary.
Councils also have the ability to, if they need to top up the grants for businesses that are getting it as well. So if they feel as though it's necessary, but that would probably be lower down their priorities.
Yeah. Keiko, I've answered that one. If we open the streaming rehearsals and recording, will be eligible for these grants? No, you will definitely be open for either the open or the closed. It is our intention you'll be able to ask for the closed. That's what we're working on at the moment. Jamie Northrop says, when do the tier 2-3 restricted grants that could be backdated to?
It'll be to whichever time the area that you're in was put into that particular tier. The only thing I would say with that is that the grant for the national lockdown is being paid is a 28-day period, because that's how long that period of grant is. For the ones that are being backdated, it's being done on a 14-day cycle. And some places, of course, might have closed slightly without a 14-day cycle. I don't think they're pro-ratering for periods of times but that's why they're doing it as a 14-day cycle rather than 28. But yeah, people can claim back to whenever they went into that particular tier. And again, there might be some places where, of course, they went from tier 2 into tier 3 and have now gone into national lockdown, where actually it will probably be 3 grants that they will be eligible for.
A few people asking about the differences between Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and England. Basically these funds are available because they've used the Barnett formula to calculate how much each of the devolved authorities would get, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, it is, but they're being administered differently in each nation as well. So for Scotland, just to quickly look at Scotland, there was a grant again available for businesses that were shut, and also for businesses that were in hardship. That was based on 2 tiers, which was up to 51k and 51k and above. They are continuing to keep those tiers, and so from what we've seen so far is that it will be up to 51k will be 2,000, and above 51k will be 3,000. And again, that will, of course, vary now, because, of course, Scotland isn't in a national lockdown, but it will vary according to which tier people are in those particular tier 2 and tier 3. But Scotland have said that they're going to match up to the English guidance and grants.
Okay. A few people have been posting they have actually just received their LRFG grants. Some were paid out today. We know they've been paid through this week. So this system is actually working, but I think the number one thing to tell people is probably don't sit back and wait for it to come to you. Actually go out and actively engage with your local authority and say, we are closed, we will need this money. I had one venue reported to me, their local authority said that if they did streaming, then they would only be able to get the open grant, not the closed grant. That's what caused us to go up and ask DCMS to clarify that with Bays and Treasury. And then somebody's added that on Wednesday, Bay stated that as long as the substantive part of the business is closed, they can get a grant. Yes, but we wanted that more clarified. We don't think that's sufficient for local authorities to say that that they understand who should be getting the grant. Somebody said, am I correct in thinking there are no grants in Wales, available in Wales if your rateable value is over 51k and you've been closed for the duration of the pandemic?
That is a good question, which I'm not sure I know the answer to. In Wales, they had 2 different grants, which were made available. Let me just get the details for that, and you can look on there. There was the Lockdown Business Fund, which was the Lockdown Non-Invested Rate Grant, which was a grant of £5,000, which was done for the fire break. And then there was a grant of £1,000 for those which were up to 12,000. The rateable values are slightly different in Wales, up to 12,000 and 12,000 to 51. Yeah, looking at that, actually, there doesn't appear to be a grant for above 51,000. Although there are still discretionary grants as well in Wales, which don't actually mention around an eligibility based on business rates. So you may be able to apply for discretionary grants on that. But again, Sam might have more information about that.
My feeling is Dave Whittle's highlighted that Birmingham City Council don't actually know what they're doing yet.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the same for most local authorities. But can I highlight that being ahead of the game here is going to mean that you're more likely to get your grant paid out quicker. So I would be on top of this. Our guidance would be on top of it. Be saying that you need this. They may be eventually tell you we have an automatic process for paying it for you, but actually being in contact with your local authority now, saying what's happening, won't be seen as a negative. Frankly, it's probably a good thing to do.
I think also don't. I know that for places like Doncaster, for example, the information they still have up on their website is based on the tier structure, the tier 2 and tier 3. So the information is wrong on some of websites. So I would look to contact council directly. And as Mark says, it basically makes them aware that you're looking for the money. The other big change, as I mentioned earlier, was that now, whereas before under the tier structure, councils were having to make many more assessments as to whether or not people were eligible or not, and then claim the money from government before they got it. This time it's changed so that the government is allocating money based on the criteria for the valuations officers, as to hospitality, accommodation, leisure and things like that. So the money should be coming from government to the councils for them to distribute rather than them having to claim it from them.
Okay, well, that sounds really good. And Tim Perry says Lambeth seems to be the same as Birmingham. They sent a letter around saying they were awaiting government guidance. Just to repeat again, and in Leeds, they built a submission portal that was then automated. It's all underway in Leeds. They're updating similar to what they did for the hospitality grant. I think basically you need to know how your local authority is going to administer this, and it doesn't hurt to contact them and say, how are you administering this? I definitely am going to need a grant, and get your hand out straight away, I think.
Yeah. This guidance was published for the first time on the 3rd of November. So yeah, they've only had a few days to look at. The other thing that I'm talking to some local councils was that due to the amounts of money, they may well wait until they've had meetings of the council executive as to how they distribute it. So it may well be another couple of weeks, a week or two before we get that full guidance for individual councils.
Yeah, I think we wanted to get ahead of this because we wanted to make sure people understood the money was there. We wanted to make sure they understood about the furlough stuff. Anything else on business grants?
Northern Ireland is the only other one I wanted to mention, which is that, again, because lockdown restrictions have been different there, they have a scheme at the moment which is actually looked at weekly. Again, it's done by rateable value, the same rateable values for England and Scotland, sorry, as England, for up to 15,000, 15 to 51, and then 51 and above. For Northern Ireland, it's been done on a basis of £800, 1,200, and then 1,600. Again, you must apply through local council areas, exactly the same on that. And that is for it's for people who've also been affected and not just for people who are closed. So the criteria is on there as well.
Yeah, there's some confusion. So just to be plain, we're not at all surprised that some of you are confused at this point. It helps to take a little bit of a break from everything that you thought you knew and just go and review all the information. The spreadsheet I put, the link that we put in here to this spreadsheet, you should follow these links out and just check what the latest information is on these particular grants, because we know there have been a number of different things you could apply for in different tier levels, in different nations, at different times. This is the latest information we have on what's going to be available from this point forward. So anyone who's feeling a little bit confused between ERF funds, fire break funds, anything like that, basically go and check this information out again. It is worth starting it again. I know I had to do that this morning to even come to this meeting, frankly.
Yeah, with the business grants, as Mark mentions, they've split it. They mainly seem to be split into two sections. There's the backdating of previous local restrictions, which of course were also in place in Wales as well before the fire break, and then there's looking at the national restrictions.
Okay, so basically, then at the end of this, we've got this document that we've shared in there. There is actually an explanation of all this, which brings us neatly on to the last thing there that we were both laughing about before we came online, which is a large number of questions have come in about state aid. I'm gonna. I mean, we don't need that screen up anymore. Let's get rid of that. It'll be slightly bigger, right? I'm going to, we're going to deal with the Culture Recovery Fund and the impact on anything you're receiving from Culture Recovery Fund in England or Wales or Scotland, and this introduction of furlough in a second, so I'll come back to that. When it comes to state aid, as a general rule, unless you're receiving over £800,000, the answer to the question, have you received state aid, whenever you're asked by this, is going to be no, you have not received state aid. And we've seen that question asked in some very weird ways. The Arts Council thing, for example, asked, can you confirm that you do not consider this to be state aid? To which the answer was yes, I can confirm that I do not consider this to be state aid. But however the question is phrased, it is unlikely that any venue in our circuit is receiving what would even fall within the remit of state aid, which is a whole lengthy explanation that me and Chris are still wading through. But to be clear, at this point in this crisis, the definition of what will count as state aid, bearing in mind that every country in the world is providing aid of some description to its industries and to its businesses, I think it's fairly safe to say you honestly don't really need to worry about this. The answer to the question is, it's pretty much no, this is not state aid. If it goes over £800,000 of money that you're receiving, we would invite you can write to me personally and I'll get a lawyer to take a look at whether there is any possibility it could be considered state aid. So only at that level do you really need to worry about it. And I think that's cumulative, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, local councils will often mention in their letter, they'll talk about de minimis, which the level is 200,000. But there was a special thing put in place during the COVID crisis that basically increased that up to 800,000 euros to allow people to support businesses in this way. So yeah. It's just something that, as you say, when you're filling in these forms, people may ask about it. And of course, if you've received any type of CRF or anything, you might think about, but it's something not to really be that concerned about. Okay,
so then that brings us neatly on with 15 minutes left to have a massive row about what do you do if you have received culture recovery funds from any pot, whether it was grassroots music venue funding in England, or whether it's stabilisation fund in Scotland, or whether it's going to be the funds that are about to be released in Wales. I know that an email has gone around to our Welsh venues today asking them to indicate what furlough money they may now claim in this period, which Sam has written to everybody about. I have had discussions with Arts Council, but I want to start with a really basic concept to make sure that we're all on the same page of not committing fraud. Right. And that concept is, you cannot double dip for this money. That's the first thing you need to understand. If you have somebody who you have claimed the salary for within your culture recovery fund, and you've specifically said, I need £5,000 to pay this person to do that role, do not put them on furlough and also claim the money from furlough in the expectation that you will be able to keep the £5,000. You will not, okay? You are only going to be able to claim one set of money for each person to the total amount that it is. And that might be, they might be furloughed all the way through the culture recovery fund period till the 31st of March, or they might be only being paid by the culture recovery fund. But the point is, and there might be a third option, you might pay them some of the time from furlough and some of the time from culture recovery fund. But the amount of money that you will get is not going to be more than the total that you can claim from any one source. And whatever you claim from one source, you cannot claim from the other. I know that sounds probably unbelievably obvious to a lot of you, but I will tell you that half the questions I've received on this, and ever since this went live on Thursday, relate to that central point. No, you cannot claim furlough and also keep the money that you were specifically paying somebody to do the salary job. However, long speech, what can happen within an Arts Council grant is you may be able to repurpose some of the money that you were going to pay somebody as a salary, if they are now furloughed, into doing something else when you are able to do it. Because the point at which you're going to need to declare your budget to Arts Council, if your grant is less than £250,000, you will not be asked to declare that, how you've spent the money, until you make your final grant claim for the final 10% of the grant. If your grant is over £250,000, Arts Council have already written to you to indicate that your grant will now be divided into 3 payments, 50% now, 40% on the point where you make a second application, and 10% at the end. The point at which you will need to declare what you're doing on furlough will be at the second declaration. When you want to draw down your 40% of the money, you will have to indicate, do you need to draw it all down, or have you furloughed some of your staff? Are you doing that? You can repurpose the money at that point as well, and Arts Council will consider that. So this is all a negotiation. So, Chris, any part of that you feel still needs clarification?
No, I think the only thing I would add to it is that people should, A, not worry too much about it right now, although they have got to, of course, think about how they're doing their furlough claims. I would also encourage people to go back and look at what they applied for on their actual application, because I know, having done an application myself and gone through it, that I can't remember exactly as to who I'd claimed as salaried staff, who I'd claimed as event staff, and particularly with Steve, the way that with Steve's calculations was that often, if a lot of the staff ended up being put into events, so you may not have even told Arts Council. You just check exactly how you have allotted this, and then start thinking about how that money will be spent for either other activity, or make sure you keep very clear records when you're doing your furlough calculations, if you are still claiming furlough, as to what exactly that money was, and also if you're using money to top up as well and things like that. Because that's the other thing, is that actually you may be using some of that money to top up people's wages and stuff like that. So you do need to make sure you keep very clear records between now and whenever you're reporting as to how that money is being used.
I think that's the absolute, that's the putting your nail on the head there. Keep really clear records. Keep really clear records of what you're doing. That's all anybody's asking you to do. If you're putting people into furlough, definitely claim the furlough money. That's the first thing to start. Definitely, absolutely, rule of thumb for everybody. If you're putting people into furlough, definitely claim the furlough money. You will at some point need to account for that if you received culture recovery funds in England or Wales or Scotland, but potentially in Northern Ireland as well. And in fact, Wales are asking you to do a little bit of that now. So they're asking you to do it. I'm going to jump through some of these questions. If you haven't received any communication from ACE regarding split payments, and you have a grant over £250,000, I imagine that's just them getting the emails out the door, but I would speak to your Arts Council England coordinator, or write to the inquiries desk and say, can I just check what's happening about my grant with regards to it being over £250,000 and potentially split payments reporting. If we claim staff in our CRF code, now they can enter those. Could we top up their wages with CRF? Yes, you could do that. It's about accounting it. If we've not received any CRF money, need furlough to pay staff in the meantime, definitely you want to put staff on furlough and claim that money. What about those that receive 90% of their grant over 250k threshold? I believe that Arts Council's process here is going to be, you will be asked to complete a form retrospectively identifying what it is that you've done, and at that point they might negotiate with you as to whether any of it has to be returned.
For those ones already, didn't they have to already have added, when they first applied, I think they would have had to already put in an activity sheet or an activity log, I think, for over 250k in any case. So it's just a continuation of that, really.
Can we repurpose if we now cannot do the gigs we expect to apply for the CRF? How do we do it? Right, and this is very important. You do not, if you are repurposing money, or you are rescheduling or reprogramming or whatever it is you're planning to do, always try and make whatever it is you plan to do in line with what you applied for. So if you plan to deliver program and activity and content or rehearsals or whatever, but you're unable to do it, start thinking about how you might be able to do it in limited circumstances, or how you might be able to do it at a future date. You don't need to tell Arts Council that now. In fact, I'm going to tell you that the head of music at Arts Council specifically asked me to tell you not to contact Arts Council with your plans of how you're going to change your programme now, because they do not have the capacity to deal with it. What they're dealing with is the issue of the finances, where they need to do that, where it's appropriate to do it. They do not want new plans from you yet. When they want them, they will contact you, and most likely they will not do that until you actually get to the point of declaring what it is you've done with your grant in order to get your last 10% of the grant. So there is no pressure on you at all right now to suddenly start doing other things to keep hold of your grant, and there's no pressure on you at all, certainly, but in fact the opposite of that. There is pressure on you to please not tell Arts Council. So we still claim furlough, but then pay back any unspent money from the CRF CRF fund at the end of March. Yes, that's exactly it. You just need to account it properly.
Check, yeah, so particularly, the other thing I'd say, Mark, is that when most people's applications, because of the fact that it was including October, when of course furlough was still in place in October, on when we were these out, will have had a report, when we finally come to reporting it, will have had a reporting line in any case about income from furlough. So they will already have to encourage that. It just may well be that that income line is a lot more. But of course, you also need to bear in mind that some of your other income lines, such as, you know, if you are open for shows, are being vastly reduced as well. So that's also going to change it. So,
okay.
Yeah,
that's what I understand, Chris. I mean, that's the conversation. I've had conversations every day this week with Arts Council and with Creative Scotland and Creative Wales, and I'm telling you that they really do understand this. And nobody needs to jump around getting all worried about it at the moment. In answer to Ian Baird is yes, that is correct, Ian. You're absolutely fine on furlough because your fund only went 31st of October. Apologies to Sarah Portney for talking quickly. I'll try and slow it down. Just to be clear, there will not be an extension of your grant. The grant will be reported by the 31st of March. If you are unable to spend this grant by the 31st of March, it is possible there will be a certain amount of negotiation around committing to delivering things beyond the 31st of March, but it won't be about expanding the time. That will happen when that happens. So think about what you're doing now and think about what you're going to do by 31st of March. Aim to spend the grant usefully, keeping your venue alive. Definitely going for the furlough. Sort that out in the accounting. It may be, if lockdown carries on, that we end up having a central discussion with the Arts Council about the need to extend the period of the grant into April or May or wherever else it is. But that hasn't happened yet. At the moment, just plan on everything ending by 31st of March.